Kirsten, my watch says 1 o'clock. Do you want to go ahead and get started?
Sure, sounds great.
All right, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, if you're on the East Coast, and good morning if you're on the West Coast or somewhere in between. Thanks for being here for today's webinar, From Resistant to Resourceful, a collaborative approach to engaging your board in fundraising. And my name is Stephen Shattuck. I'm the VP of Marketing here at Bloomerang, and I'll be moderating today's little discussion. And before we begin, just a few housekeeping things. I wanted to let everyone know that we are recording this presentation, and I'll be making that recording as well as the slides available to everyone a little later on this afternoon. So look for an email from me probably around 3 or 4 o'clock Eastern Time a little later on. You'll be able to watch the webinar, share it with coworkers, and just kind of relive the presentation if you wanted to review the content. So look for that a little bit later on. Also want everyone to know that we do have a chat box here on the webinar screen. So as our guest is presenting, feel free to send any questions or comments our way. We'll both see those, and we'll be able to answer some questions formally during a Q&A session towards the end of the presentation. We like to save maybe 10 or 15 minutes towards the end. So don't be shy about sending any questions or comments. We'll try to get to just as many as we can. And just in case you're new to these webinars, if this is your first one, welcome. We do these webinars once a week here at Bloomerang. In addition to that, Bloomerang, the actual company, we make a donor database software. So if you're interested in donor management, maybe switching providers or creating a new provider for yourself, do check us out. You can go to our website, bloomerang.co, to learn more about Bloomerang, in addition to all the great content that we put out, like these webinars. So I want to introduce today's guest. She is Kirsten Bullock, CFRE, MBA. Hey there, Kirsten. How's it going?
Hi, good. How are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for being here again. Kirsten did an awesome webinar for us last year, so I just had to have her back. And for those of you who don't know her, she's an author, she's a trainer, she's a consultant. She works with leaders of nonprofit organizations. She helps boards become more engaged and help them raise the money that they need to further their mission. She actually earned her designation as a CFRE in 2002, and she's been working since 1995 with healthcare organizations, social service providers, national and local ministries, and international membership associations. She's also on the board of AFP in Greater Louisville, and she's an AFP Master Trainer. She's also the author of some books. One of them is Simple Steps to Growing Your Donors, and is a contributing author to the Essential Fundraising Handbook for Small Nonprofits. So it's just awesome to have Kirsten. This is going to be great content. I'm really excited about all this, and I don't want to take anything more away from her. So why don't you go ahead and get us started, Kirsten?
Okay, will do. Thanks so much for your kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here. Lots of information to share. But before I get into too much detail, I want to go back in time to the first time I got to work with a board. And it was, I guess, right about 1998, 1999. And I had just started as the 6th development director in 6 years for a healthcare organization. They'd been going through quite a few different people. So I started, I was pretty young at the time, didn't know a whole bunch about boards, didn't know a whole bunch about being a development director. It was my first time in that role. And so it was really trial by fire in a lot of ways. But working with the board is one of the parts that I really loved, that I really enjoyed, because people there were passionate about the organization. They were excited about what was going on. But sometimes when it came to fundraising, all of a sudden their heels would skid in and things would screech to a halt. At least that's what it felt like. So over an 18-month period, we were able to work with them, listen to what they were saying, really help engage them in ways that felt comfortable for them. And it's been really exciting over the last several years to be able to use that same approach with a lot of different organizations. And so that's a lot of what has informed my presentation today. It's not just things I've read in a book. These are really things that I've implemented, used with clients, used with employers to help engage boards in the fundraising process. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk really quickly about what a collaborative approach is, about team members and roles, and then really dive into the knowledge base. 5 different key pieces of knowledge that we need in order to be successful with this. And then a 7-step process that I've put together that helps incorporate that knowledge base. So lots of information to share on that. The collaborative approach. Basically, it's people working together, right? Everybody jumping in, doing what they can, and really working together. And this collaborative piece is really important when working with boards because a lot of times we see it as a battle of the wits, where again, people to do something that maybe they're not interested in. But if we really sit down and listen to what their fears are, what their resistance is, a lot of times we can break through that. So looking at it as a collaborative process with everybody doing a piece of the pie, a piece of the puzzle, so it all comes together and works effectively. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. One, it's more fun when there's more people involved, certainly. And another is that I really do believe that we're better together. If we have 7 different approaches, 7 different ideas at the table, we're going to be able to come up with a strategy that's a lot stronger than anything that any single one of us could come up with. So by having that group process, those group dynamics, different strengths, different ideas, we're going to come up with something that's really, really powerful and helpful for us. So I think this is really the first step, is to really see everything as a collaborative process, not see any of this is trying to manipulate somebody into doing something that they're not comfortable with. It's really figuring out the best role for each person to play. And speaking of different roles that people play, there's basically 3 different groups and then 2 individual people who are mostly part of the process. We've got board members, and the board members' role is to be advocates out in the community, to probably raise money in some way, or to at least be involved in that process. They're the link between the organization and people out in the community. And of course, there's also the fiscal oversight, the governance role, and there's other things that they have to do. But they also have a life that's outside of the organization. They've got a full-time job. They've got a lot of things going on. So we need to make the most of the time that we have available from them. Staff members. That's our development staff. It's also program staff. It's also people in other areas. And a lot of times program staff, they'll help provide stories because we need those stories to be able to raise money. They'll help interface with volunteers. And so there's a lot of things that they're involved with in the fundraising process, also things outside. It's also marketing people, if that's in a different department. So they have a piece of the fundraising puzzle. Donors, of course, are partners in the mission of the organization, because without the money, we can't do what we do. If we don't have money for payroll, we can't have program staff providing programs. If we don't have money for what we do, for reaching out into the community, then we just need that. They're really our partners in that. So seeing them as partners in the process. And then at the middle, the Chief Executive Officer and the Chief Development Officer, whatever title that person has in your organization. They're at the center of the piece. And we will be talking really soon about having volunteers as part of the fundraising process, because the board, and probably also, hopefully, a committee of volunteers who may or may not be on the board, so you can expand that beyond your board. But definitely volunteers in this process, and board members are usually key to getting that volunteer involvement. So I just wanted to cover that quickly before we really jump into the meat of what we're going to talk about. Here's the 5 different bases of knowledge that I found that are essential in getting things moving as it relates to fundraising. Understanding the whole change management process, because anytime we introduce something new, there's going to be a resistance to it just because it's new, just because it's a change. And if we can understand some of the psychology behind how people respond to change, we can be effective at implementing that change in our organization. Also, understanding communication styles. You've probably had the instance, I know I have, where you meet somebody and things just don't click. There's something between the two of you that it's not easy. And so there's extra work that needs to be done. And a lot of times that's because of differing communication styles. I had a development director that I was working with, was the assistant development director, and he would always go into sharing stories and these long, I'm adjusting my cord because it was getting staticky. I think that's better. So he would go on these long, sharing long stories and all these ideas, and I was getting frustrated because I just wanted to get things done. Well, it turns out I was a high D and he was a high I, and if you're familiar with the DISC profile, and I'll talk about that a little more in a little bit, there was some conflict that was there. And once we recognized those different communication styles, we were able to work together a lot more effectively. So if we can understand better the communication styles of our board members and those people, those volunteers who are helping with fundraising, we can be a lot more essential. We can be a lot more effective at integrating them into the fundraising process. Learning theory is the third one, because we each go through a process when we learn a new thing. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not so easy, but by understanding the process and again the psychology of what we do, when we're learning something new, we can help coach some of that. Because for a lot of our fundraising volunteers, they don't know much about fundraising. For us who are in it, we're comfortable with it, we know it. It's not scary to ask for a gift from somebody, but if we can remember how we responded when we were first learning, I think we can have a better appreciation for what our board members are going through. So providing a lot more support through the process. Leadership and team building is also essential. I don't know if you're familiar with the Leadership Challenge by Coos and Posner, but that whole process of being a leader, building a strong team, really important in this process. And then, of course, knowledge about fundraising, because if we're getting people involved in raising, of course, we need to have that. But that's just one of those 5 key areas. Let's see. And then in the second, over those 7 steps that you can see here, creating a compelling vision, having a simple fundraising plan that you can share with the board, developing the messaging so that the board members can feel comfortable sharing that message out, having a pitch kit or materials that the board can refer to when they're going out to ask so they feel prepared, they feel like they know what they're talking about. Getting the board engaged with figuring out how they're going to be involved in fundraising, having their partnership in that planning process. It ensures their buy-in, really important. Providing the training for our board so they can feel comfortable asking, so they know some of the answers that they might get and how to respond to those. And of course, really, really essential, checking in on an ongoing basis so our board members don't check out, which often happens if we're not following up and walking alongside them through that process. And I will say too, this is a really difficult topic to cover because there's so many different obstacles that can come up when we're trying to engage boards in fundraising. But by taking into account these 5 different knowledge bases, we can address probably 90–95% of them, 5 to 10%, where this may or may not help. And that's why it's so hard. And whenever we have people involved, that makes it really difficult. So a couple key things about change management. First, having buy-in from people is absolutely essential. If we don't have somebody's buy-in up front, it can be really difficult to get people engaged. And second part of it is to understand that there's going to be resistance. Anytime we try to change something, there's going to be resistance. And a good illustration of what happens through the change process, and changecycle.com has given me permission to use this illustration. And if you're interested in learning more about what they do, it's changecycle.com, great resource. But basically, when we go through change, it's almost like going through the stages of grief because we're letting go of something. We're having to lose something that's comfortable. And even if it's not the best thing, it's what we're used to. It's our comfort zone. On my Facebook page earlier today, the comfort zone is a beautiful thing, but nothing good ever happens there. It's the great stuff happens outside our comfort zone. But in the case of change, we need to let go of something to be able to embrace something new. And that loss can be really, really uncomfortable. Stage 2 is doubt. It's a little bit of resentment, some skepticism, and resistance to the change. If we continue going through the process, it eases a little bit, and it goes from resistance to just kind of discomfort. But once we reach that, we enter a danger zone, and two things happen during this danger zone. Either we move through it because we have a strong enough vision that everybody's bought into that we can move through it, or we zoom straight back up to stage 1 again and have to start the process all over again. And the really difficult thing about change is once you've gone up, once you've hit the danger zone and had to move up to stage 1 again, each time you come around to that danger zone again, it's going to be really, really easy to just shoot back up to stage 1 and not make it through it. So it's like each time you hit the wall, it gets stronger somehow. Some psychology behind that, I'm sure. But really important to recognize that just when we're thinking that we might be seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, we need to be really careful to not sit back and assume that things are going to go well. This is the time where we really need to be working with our board members, helping them see, remember the big vision, the end goal that we have in mind, so that they'll shoot through that danger zone instead of hitting the wall and having to start back over again. So taking this into account anytime we're trying to do any change in our organizations, and especially getting our board members engaged in fundraising. This is something to remember. Of course, after the danger zone enters a phase of discovery, people can see, understand, they start to integrate the change and start moving forward. But that danger zone is that place where we can really go off the rail. The second knowledge base that we're going to talk about is communication styles. And I mentioned that already and mentioned the DISC profile. So two main things to remember here is to appreciate other people's strengths, because with each communication style, there's strengths and there's also weaknesses. And there's no good, best communication styles. They're all just different ways that we communicate with each other. And the second part of that is helping others save face. We never put somebody else in a situation where they're going to feel like a failure. Really remember this. And by understanding people's communication styles, we can usually better match them to a role in fundraising that's going to feel comfortable for them. So kind of a quick overview of DISC communication styles. There's a axis that goes from active to thoughtful and another one that goes from skeptical to trusting. So within the dominance area, folks are very driven, very want to get things done, laying out the tasks and doing them. So they're active in getting a lot of things done, but also skeptical and questioning. They're in that area. For influencers, high eyes, they tend to tell a lot of stories, they love people, and they see people first, and then the tasks are kind of secondary. Whereas with high Ds, the task is the main thing, and then people are a tool to do the task. So influencers, very active, and also very trusting of their environment. S is very steady. Some people have equated this to like the Labrador Retriever kind of thing, very friendly, want to maintain status quo at all costs. And sometimes that can get in the way of change because they're much more thoughtful. They want to spend some time thinking about things and getting used to things before changing. So typically, because the S's and C's are more thoughtful, they'll take a little bit longer to move forward when change starts to happen. And then high C's, very detail-oriented. I worked with a group of people once who were all, it was a professional association and it was an accounting-related field, so very detail-oriented. If I was adding up 5 numbers and for some reason I had the Excel formula wrong and it gave the wrong number, they would definitely pick up on that. So very detail-oriented, conscientious. And again, just like the high Ds, somewhat skeptical and questioning, but very thoughtful and takes a while to think things through. So hopefully you were able to see yourself in one of those communication styles. Let's see. This presentation platform, it's pretty simple. So third area, understanding learning theory. Now, I don't know how old you were when you learned to ride a bike, but I was kind of a late bloomer when it came to that. It took me forever to get rid of my training wheels. I must have been 10 or 11 at least before I learned. And there were a lot of skinned knees and elbows and falling off the bike and frustration. But I went ahead and learned it because it was something to know. And there's 2 pieces in this learning theory. One is that as adults, it's really hard to learn something new. We don't want to look like we don't know what we're doing in front of people. And so on our boards, we have professionals who are very proficient in their field. They're good at what they do. They have their comfort level with that, with the things that they know how to do. But as adults, if we are going through the process of learning something new, that's scary because we feel like we're not going to do it very well. And of course, we're not going to do it very well the first time because it takes time to learn it. So if we can understand with our board members that they're having to learn something new here and having that patience with them and making sure that we're with them through the process. So there's basically 4 different stages of learning. We go through, when we're starting to learn something new, we start with unconscious incompetence. That means we don't know what we don't know. And let's say we've just had a board meeting and we've shared about how important it is for everybody to get involved in fundraising. And all the board members are really excited. They're saying, sure, I'll do this, no problem. This sounds great. So, but what they're at the stage that they're at that point is just incompetence. They don't know what they don't know. But then what happens is they go home and they start thinking about it. And they hit, again, another wall. And they realize, oh my goodness, I don't know this. They enter that conscious incompetence phase where they realize they have seen what they don't know, and that can scare them. And so what they're going to do, human nature, is we avoid things that we're not comfortable with, or we tend to put things off. So pretty much it's the next board meeting, nothing's happened, you're frustrated, they're kind of embarrassed, but what happened was they hit that wall when they realized they didn't know what they were doing. And again, this is a stage where we need to walk with our donors through, or walk with our volunteers through, so that they can get through that, recognize what they don't know, and start learning it, and know that it's okay if they're not perfect right off. Sometimes done is than perfect, although perfect is good if we can get there. It's just not a realistic bar 100% of the time. So helping our board members understand that, or other volunteers in fundraising. So once they get through the conscious incompetence phase, they reach conscious competence. That's where they're getting pretty good at it. They still have to think about it. It still takes conscious effort to do it well. And then finally, the 4th phase, unconscious unconscious competence, where it just comes as second nature. And when our board members get to this point, really great idea to begin using them as mentors for some of the newer board members. So then you're not having to do quite as much as the hands-on work. You would have people already who've been through the process who can help those folks who are newer there. Fourth is leadership and team building. Again, I'll mention it again, Coos and Posner with the Leadership Challenge. Great resource. It focuses on 5 different stages of being a leader, 5 different things to remember. But the 2 main things with this, best for the organization. And on the surface, that seems pretty easy to do. But sometimes we get into meetings and somebody has a different idea and a different way to do things, and we think that our way is the best way. So we might assume that, well, they must not want what's best for the organization because they don't want to do it my way. So just remembering everyone will help overcome some of those feelings that you might get and that they might get. So making sure that everybody's on the same page. And then focusing on those win-win outcomes. How can we do things that will definitely show that we're better together? And the 5 things that the Leadership Challenge looks at is modeling the way, inspiring a shared vision, challenging the process. Because just because something works doesn't mean there's not a better way to do it, which is sometimes we think, well, if it's not broken, why should we fix it? But sometimes there are better ways to do things, and that's what challenging the process is all about. And sometimes what may feel like a threat from a board member might just be the first step in creating a better way to do things. Others to act. This is all about providing the resources, the tools, things that people need to do what we want them to do better, but also releasing it and letting them take action in a way that's comfortable, for them. So providing sources, but also the freedom for people to implement as they see fit. This 5th one, encouraging the heart, is one of the hardest things that I've seen in nonprofits. I was at an AFP meeting a while ago, and some of the most senior leaders who were celebrating 25 or more years in the profession were getting up and they were sharing some information. They were sharing tips for people who are new in the field. And my heart almost broke when one of them said, you know, one of the things that you need to get used to is that you're not going to get credit for anything that you do, and you're not going to ever have a chance to celebrate it because there's just more things to be done. And I think we really need to be intentional about finding ways to celebrate, finding ways to do a group hug or to celebrate when things have gone really well, to take maybe once a year having an event where you celebrate all the great things that have happened that year. Because in the nonprofit world, we get so busy and there's so many things that need to be done and there's so many people who need our help that it's easy to get really hung up in continuing to press forward all the time. And if we don't take some time to rejuvenate, we're going to end up burned out. And frankly, I think burnout is one of the major elephants in the room in the nonprofit world right now. We've got so many people who are working 50, 60 hours a week. They're making much less than what they'd make in the corporate world. And anyway, that's not this conversation. But encouraging the heart is one of the ways that we can address that burnout and help to avoid it. So the impact of, there's a question that came on about the impact of board retreats related to resistance. There's definitely a place for board retreats. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. It depends on on what the goal of the retreat is, certainly, and how it's implemented. So a lot of the 7 steps that I'm going to share, some of them can be done just tapped onto a board meeting. Of course, it's always a good idea to get together as a group for an extended period of time, but it's not always necessary, and sometimes it's not always possible to do. But I'll talk more about a couple of the trainings and workshops, and some of those are really good to do as part of a board retreat. So leadership. And finally, of course, fundraising knowledge. For you, yes, you need fundraising knowledge, but also sharing the right information with your leadership so that they can make sense about fundraising. Because a lot of times, there's a lot that goes into fundraising. There's a lot of different factors that come into play when it comes to effectiveness of different approaches. There's the messaging, there's the timing, there's just all sorts of things that go into play. And it's easy who's new to the process to think it's really simple and well, this is how it works in my business, so this is how it would work for you. But sometimes that doesn't directly correlate. So if we're not giving them good information about fundraising, they can't make good fundraising decisions. It's impossible. So it's up to us to provide that for them. And the other thing to remember too, and this is related to burnout in a lot of ways, but ideal does not always equal what happens in real. So a lot of times we go to workshops, we go to trainings, we get all these ideas about how things would work in a perfect fundraising world. But then we go back to our organization and we think, oh my goodness, none of that can work here because we're just so different. Ideal is good because it gives us something to strive for, as long as we recognize that if our organization isn't there, we don't need to throw up our hands and give up completely. We can start with where we're at and then put together baby steps to grow into the future. So with that fundraising knowledge, and hopefully you have that already. 7 steps. And I already did a recap at the beginning, so I'm not going to go through them now. But let's start with creating a compelling vision. And this was one of the things that came into play with the change management and getting through that brick wall, that barrier that we were talking about, that danger zone. If we want to get through that, one of the most essential ways to do that is by having a compelling vision. For a lot of organizations, this would be the first board retreat, a time to come together, figure out what the vision is, what the strategic plan is to get there. But this vision is really essential. And developing it as a group rather than one person saying, this is what our vision is. Because if one person comes up with it, nobody else really has ownership of it. It's that other person's vision. But if the board has been a part of it, the board with any other key fundraising volunteers who are going to be working with you, if they've been part of developing it, part of creating that, they're going to have a lot more ownership of it. They're going to feel like it's their vision as well as the other person's vision, and it's something that they've been a part of creating. So they're going to be more committed to making that happen and coming to fruition if they've been part of that initial visioning process. Now, this isn't something, just like the strategic plan, it's not something that needs to happen every year. In fact, a vision could be 20 years out, it could be 50 years out, or 5 years out, depending on where your organization is at and what your goals are for the future. But really important to do that together as a group. And again, this is a great first step, first place to do one of those board retreats, or just add on an hour to a board meeting and spend some intensive, committed time talking about it. The second is more internal. This is your fundraising plan, and having it in a format that can easily be shared with the board, because when the board starts to talk about what kind of fundraising things they're going to do, you want to make that they're looking at things that will add to the fundraising plan. It's not taking over things that staff is doing. It's not taking over those routine kind of things that need to get done. The role of the board is to go beyond that, build relationships, be that connector between the organization and the community. So in order to help keep their thinking at that level, we need to first share a basic fundraising plan with them that shares everything that's already happening so that they can feel a comfort level that all of that's getting done, and then help them focus on those higher level type goals and strategies and things that only the board can do. I like to do this as a facilitated session where provide information, the specific types of information that I usually provide. Information on return on investment of different fundraising strategies, really essential. Information on how effective different ask types are. So how effective a in-person ask is versus a phone call versus the organization sending a letter in the mail. And for every organization, it's going to be different. But typically, in a one-on-one ask situation, there's a 1 in 2 chance that that person will say yes, which means there's also that person will say no. And when I first shared that with the board, I thought that they would feel intimidated because there was a pretty good chance they were going to get a no. But what I heard back from people is that that didn't intimidate them at all. It actually freed them up so that they knew that they weren't expected to be perfect. They knew all of a sudden that if they got a no, it wasn't the end of the world. It was just, oh, that's normal. So adding that normalcy that a no is okay. If you, let's see, if send something out on their letterhead to one of their friends, I'm trying to remember the specific numbers, but I think there's a 20% chance that a gift will come in. And if they call somebody on the phone, it's somewhere in between that 20% and 50%. So making sure that people know the effectiveness of different strategies so that they can plan good ways to spend their time. With the messaging and case statement, really essential to have this really identified because it's what provides the information for board members to share as they're talking with other people. So having all of this information in one section. And basically the overview of the statement, I'm sure you know this already, but covering what the needs are in the community, talking about how the organization is addressing those needs, what kind of impact the organization is having, why your organization is the best one suited to address this need, and how much it's going to cost. And just as important as all of that is to integrate story into it. And ideally a story of one person who's had an interaction with your organization that's been impactful. And for each of the organizations that I've worked with, I've had typically one key story that I'll share as part of my presentations, and I'll get really good at that one story. But if we can teach our members how to talk about one story, that's definitely a huge first step in getting them engaged in fundraising. Because when people make a decision to give, of course, it's typically based on an emotional decision, but then people usually also look for facts to back it up. So providing both of that, but with a real focus on the story. Having a case statement will make it a lot easier to get our board members involved. And it's also the resource for the pitch kit that I'll talk about now. And the pitch kit basically provides, and just a name that I made up, I probably heard it somewhere, but putting all of the information that the board member needs to be successful in one place so you can provide it to them, answers all the questions, provide sample scripts, donation forms, all targeted towards helping them be successful in fundraising. This accomplishes two things. One, it of course gives them the information that they need, but two, it also takes away one of the excuses. because a lot of times one of the first things that will come up if we ask our board members to be involved in fundraising is, oh, well, I don't know what to say. So it starts with, I don't know what to say, followed up with, I don't know what to do. So we need to make sure to address those. And this is how we can provide the information they need to be successful in asking for money. Next is having a board fundraising planning session. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to have the buy-in and support of the board. It builds buy-in, builds engagement. It makes sure that they feel part of the process. And if they feel like they've been part of the process of building it, they're a lot more likely to actually engage and do the activities that they're talking about. So again, sharing information about return on investment, response rates, all that fun kind of stuff. I want to make sure that I leave lots of time for questions. If you have questions that come up, feel free to go ahead and use your question box to submit those, and I'll be answering those as we go. So the personal board member fundraising plan, I usually do that as part of the fundraising planning session. So we identify ways that the board members are going to be involved, and then we allow them to get engaged in some way in the process. So on there's a sample of this available at bulletconsulting.net/board-resources, a sample personal board member fundraising plan. So basically what it is just a sheet that provides different options, different ways that people can be involved in fundraising, and lets them opt in for those ways that they'll feel comfortable with. This accomplishes a couple things. One, it makes sure that they see all the different ways that they can be involved in fundraising, provides some variety. And two, it changes the effectiveness of your follow-up with them. So instead of calling them and say, hey, why aren't you getting involved in fundraising? The conversation's more along the lines of, hey, let's talk about, on your personal board member fundraising plan, you mentioned that these were the things that you'd like to do. How's that going for you? And how can I help you get to the next stage? So really, it really simplifies the follow-up process and changes it from something that sounds a little like hounding and being a little bit of a nag. It changes it from that into, hey, how can I be a resource to help you accomplish your goals that you've laid out in this personal board member fundraising plan? So it really helps move that process forward. Also, of course, providing some training and asking, demystifying it. Sometimes people can be scared of things that they don't understand. So the main thing that I try to get across with boards, and I hope you do this with your board as well, is that it's not about money. And I believe that each of us, as we were growing up, each human in the United States or around the world, had a desire when they were growing up to have a positive impact on the world, to make the world a better place, to do good things. But a lot of people get sidetracked by work, by career, by family, by all these other good things that are out in the world. And so they lose track of that desire that they had. So as professionals asking for money, or when we have volunteers who are out asking for money, it's really about helping people reconnect with that desire to change the world and seeing if our organization is a good fit for them, to help them accomplish what it is that they want to do, the impact on the world. And so if we can help people understand that it's not about the money, it's really about offering an opportunity, seeing if it's a good fit, and helping people reconnect with that desire to change and improve the world. And it also provides practice, of course. And I'm checking the time, but the exercise that I usually do, instead of having the typical role play, where you have two people up front and they're doing all the work, I usually break it into teams and have one team be the asker, one team be the potential donor, and then only have one person playing each role at a time, but rotating it so different people are sitting in the chair. It's engaging everybody. They never quite know when they're going to be the next person to sit in the chair and play the role, but it engages everybody a lot more than the typical role play. And the 7th step, checking in so board members don't check out. This is probably the most important and most overlooked aspect of engaging our boards. Because if we're not checking in on an ongoing basis, it sends the message that it's really not all that important. And I know what you're saying. I don't have time. There's all these other things competing for my attention. I don't have time. I say make the time. Look at your calendar, figure out what you're spending time on. Identify 1 or 2 things that can wait, maybe a couple things that aren't quite as important. Because if we can get our board members engaged in fundraising, if we can help them through that initial resistance, through that initial process, they're going to have so much positive impact on our organizations and on the bottom line. So we have to make time for this. It's really essential. I know it's easy to push it off, but make time every week to check in with a couple board members. Maybe not everybody every time, but over the course of a month, check in with everybody at least once offline, at least for the first 3 months, to make sure that you're getting through that resistance. And the fun thing that happens when board members start coming back to the board with stories of their success, with interactions with donors that were exciting, and where the donor was saying thank you to the asker for coming, for thanking them for asking for money. It happens. And so when board members come back and share those stories, it creates some enthusiasm and it creates some excitement. And so we move through that process, and it really is truly like a snowball once we get it going. So we've covered a lot of information today about the 5 different pieces of the knowledge base that we're looking at, the 7 steps. And I hope that's given you some information to help start moving forward. Maybe the whole thing together is going to work for you, but I'm sure pieces and some information that will work for you. So while you're thinking about it right now, and while I start to scan the questions, go ahead and jot down 2 things that you want in the next 30 days. Just 2 things. Look back over your notes or think through the different points that I made and try to identify just 2 things that you're going to do, specific things, so that when you get off the phone, when you get off this webinar, you'll be able to start implementing those right away. So let's jump into questions. Let's see, the relationship of type of ask to the amount. That really depends on, each organization is going to be slightly different. But anytime an organization is asking for a major gift, that really should be in person. The definition of major gift, though, is going to change for each organization. I know one agency here locally, their entry-level major is $150. I know another one, their entry-level major gift is $10,000. So for every organization, it's going to be different. Hospitals and universities, typically their entry major gift is a lot higher than social service organizations. But typically, for smaller organizations, about $500 is a good threshold. For larger, it might bump up to $1,000 or $2,500. Let's see. Is checking in a board chair responsibility? Great question. Sometimes, if you have a board chair who can do that, that's great. Sometimes you can recruit somebody who's going to be the chair of the fundraising committee, and then that would be a good person to have do it. Sometimes it's the development person starting out or the executive director. It depends a lot on the organization, who's driving this, how mature the program is, how engaged the board chair is. Sometimes at the beginning of the process, they may not be. So the right person really depends on your organization, and you always want it to be somebody who's going to be supportive, encouraging, and be able to do that well. So somebody with pretty high communication skills. A source for the stats on asking. That was from I'm going to see if I can look that up while I look at the next question. And I'm pretty sure that it was from Grassroots Fundraising Journal. I think it was I'm trying to remember what time frame it was. I think it was about February, March of 2013. But if you go to the Fundraising Journal, they have a place where you can search for past articles, and I'm sure they'll have that there. How involved do you feel program people ought to be with board funding efforts? Usually there's not a whole bunch of interaction between program staff and board, just because it's a whole different level of the board's typically looking at governance, being an advocate. Program staff are typically running the program much more internally focused. So I would say really that the two main people who are engaged with the board are specifically the executive director and the chief development officer. And with governance issues, you don't want a whole bunch of overlap, or you don't really want to muddy the waters by having too much direct program board interaction. How do you manage issues that may arise from sharing donor-specific information with board members? For example, the privacy of donor information in contrast to the usefulness of board members knowing actual gift giving by individuals to determine better ask amounts and tactics. Typically with organizations who are doing a lot of major gifts, this is information that's shared in confidence. The board members will sign a confidentiality agreement or something to that effect, but they're working on behalf of their organization. They're part of the organization. So there really isn't a privacy issue there, but you do want to make it really clear that the information is only to be used to help the organization, and that it's held in confidence. And typically, at least for campaigns, capital campaigns, if you're sharing that information, it's only shared and it's collected at the end of the meeting and shredded. So it's not things that people take with them. It's just used during the course of the meeting. So you wouldn't be emailing it out. You wouldn't be putting it in any format that would be easy to share. Any recommended sources to acquire a template for a fundraising plan? There's nothing that comes to mind right away, but a resource that I often use is, I think it's called Advancing, is one source. Supportingadvancement.com is another. They've got lots of great template samples, assortments. And let me see if I can. The Tony Padera site is, I think, raise-funds.com, and he's got a lot of great resources too. And then, of course, if you want to go to my website, there's a free 7-day fundraising planning thing that you can sign up for, and some other resources that are there. So Connie, are startup nonprofits different from established programs? Oh, absolutely. Because in an established program, you're focusing about 50-50 on retention and also on acquiring new donors. So with established programs, you have some ongoing sustainability that's already in place because you have a core of donors already. When you're in startup phase, really the first phase of starting up a nonprofit is about finding a few people, a few organizations, a few places that will provide funding, and then building a more diverse funding base after that, but using the first 3 to 5 years of startup money to fund the beginning startup of the fundraising program. One of the biggest things that I see with startup groups is that they don't invest in fundraising. They don't use that startup funds to start building a solid base. They spend 100% of it on programs, which means it's not going to be sustainable into the future. So definitely make sure to allocate a portion of your funds for your startup nonprofit to fundraising and long-term sustainability for your organization. Let's see, how do you engage board donations to the organization themselves? I would say if they're not, somebody can't ask for money if they're not giving money themselves. They just have no credibility. So really what we need to do is make sure that 100% of our board members are giving, and having that as one of the criteria for board engagement. Now, if you already have board members recruited under a different policy, it's going to be really difficult to enforce that. But what you can do is have it as a requirement for incoming board members. So making sure it's added to the job description and new people, and that you don't just provide it in writing to them and say, oh, well, I provided it to them, why didn't they read it? Sit down with them, or have somebody sit down with them, whether it's the executive director, the board president, whether it's the chair of the fundraising committee, the chair of the nominating committee, the chief development officer, if that's something that's that person is involved in. Whatever the system, have somebody sit down with them, walk through what the requirements are, and make sure that they understand it. So you're giving it to them, but you're also verbally going through it as part of a meeting. And you can do it with 3 or 4 people at the same time or one-on-one, but just make sure that you've gone through that and everybody knows what they're signing on for. And having your board members make a financial contribution themselves is, of course, a whole different topic. I could have a whole training just on that. And I'm noticing that I have about 2 minutes left. So Maggie, thank you for this question because it's a great one to end with. Would you communicate stories at every board meeting? Absolutely. Because what we want to do is make sure that our board is staying on focus for the mission. So having some sort of moment for mission at every board meeting, it'll give our board members something to share as they go out in the community. If we're sharing stories, if we're sharing updated facts, updated information, new programs, whatever it is, having some thing at the beginning of every single board meeting that's focused on that mission will help everybody stay focused on what's really important about the work that you're doing. And it's really hard for boards because they feel so disconnected from the frontline work that's going on. So sometimes it feels like they're just bureaucrats sitting in a meeting making decisions. So if we can help them stay focused on that end result, on that child who's getting food, on that college student who's able to stay in college and has a future, there's just all sorts of great things that happen from sharing that information. So yes, absolutely. A moment for mission to start off every single board meeting. Great.
Well, great, Kirsten. That was really fabulous, and thanks to everyone for asking questions. I know we didn't get to quite all of them there in the chat room, but is it fair to say that you'd be willing to answer questions via email?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Well, please do reach in. Why don't you tell folks a little bit more about, how in general they can get in touch with you, check out your website?
Okay. Yeah, my website is bullockconsulting.net, and lots of resources there. I do every week a weekly roundup on my blog of different nonprofit headlines and news and tips and things that are going out, so you can follow my blog on my website. Definitely feel free to email Kirsten@bullockconsulting.net, and my phone number 502-509-5004. And I would love to hear from you, love to see if I can help.
Great. Well, thanks so much for being here and spending an hour sharing all your knowledge. I definitely heard a lot of new things that I haven't heard about when you talk about boards. I really enjoyed it. Hopefully everyone else enjoyed it as much as I did. Just so everyone knows, we do these webinars once a week. We've got a lot of other great resources on our website. So check out the resources page on bloomerang.co. We've got a really cool webinar coming up 1 week from today. We're going to talk about grant writing. So that'll be an interesting conversation. If that looks interesting to you, please do register. It's totally free. It'll be totally educational. We've got some other programs listed there on our webinar page on through the end of the year, so you may see a topic that interests you. Feel free to register there. We'd love to see you again. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Just so everyone knows, I will be sending out the recording as well as the slides in just a few hours, just as soon as it gets done uploading to YouTube. So look for an email from me a little later on. And we'll end it there. So have a great rest of your day, and we will talk to you again soon.